A&M was a great, I mean, that's, Vince and I were together then. We were married in 76, and they had just signed with A&M, I think, the year before, or that year. No, it was the year before, 75, I think. 4 or 5, I can't remember. It was the 70s. And Prairie and Michael painted the old studio, Charlie Chaplin studio, that was A&M Records. Herb Albert and Jerry Moss were two of the nicest people in the music industry that I ever met. They were just completely, really nice people. And the studio was great. I loved everything about A&M. The problem was, once again, here's a band that no one really knows how not only to record, but how to market them. And the main problem, I think, what I always did, I always thought this, and I knew it, was management. It was really easy to go to the record company and take a $50,000 advance. How many times are you going to do that? And then you have to go on the tour, you have to go on the road the whole fucking year. You've got no time to create. Now you owe an album in the spring. Where's that coming from? So it just got like that.
That was Lori Welnick talking about the A&M years for the Tubes. Welcome back to Missing Man, the Vince Welnick Story. This is episode 3, and I'm your host, Thom Jennings. If you haven't had a chance to listen to episodes 1 and 2, I suggest you go back. It'll make this story a little bit easier to follow. At the end of our last episode, the Tubes had just finished their time at A&M Records. Before departing A&M Records, they had submitted a record called Suffer for Sound that was rejected by the label. This was by design so they could find another record contract. The label that they wound up landing on was Capitol Records. And the Capitol Records years are very important to not only the story of the Tubes, but the story of Vince Welnick. After the Tubes submitted Suffer for Sound, the group found itself in deep debt to the label. And even though they were a good concert draw, they still weren't making any money. And the reason for that is fairly simple. They didn't have any hits. When the group signed to Capitol Records, one of their first priorities was to record a hit. And how were they going to do that? They hooked up with David Foster. Now, we all know David Foster now as the hit maker, producer, reality TV star, whatever. But back then, David Foster had some success. He had just finished working with Earth, Wind & Fire. And if you listen to the Outside Inside album, which we'll be talking about in a little bit, you can definitely hear the Earth, Wind & Fire influence. Foster was going to move the group's sound more towards rhythm and blues, but also make it a lot more accessible. But it was going to come at a cost. There's an old adage, be careful what you wish for. We're going to find out that the David Foster years were not the years that the Tubes wished for, even though it produced a couple of the band's biggest hits. Now, before we go any further, full disclosure here. The 2 records that David Foster produced for the Tubes, The Completion Backward Principle and Outside Inside, are 2 of my favorite records by the Tubes. I absolutely love them. And in many ways, that makes it that much harder to tell the story because of what it did to the band. But before we go any further and talk more in depth about the dynamic between David Foster and the Tubes, I want to share the story about how I first came to know the band. Some of you may remember a show called SCTV.
From all over the world, musicians come to Gil Fisher's Scuttlebutt Lodge to be on The Fishin' Musician.
Hi, I'm Gil Fisher, the Fishin' Musician, and welcome again to another exciting edition of our show. Tonight, the Tubes are with us. That's going to be great. We were fishing for largemouth bass. What an exciting trip that was. We got film highlights of the trip, plus a song by the boys, and we'll be chatting with them right after this important message. Right, Shadow? Fellas, it's a pleasure having you on the show, and it was a pleasure fishing with you. You guys are fine musicians, fine sportsmen, and you really have a zest for the great outdoors. I must admit that. A pleasure, really was.
I think I speak for all the boys when I say that this largemouth bass fishing trip was really the highlight of our sporting careers.
Oh, really? Well, coming from you
Nothing like
tubes,
it.
coming from you tubes, that's something special to me, old Gil.
Boy.
What a great moment in the history of the Tubes. Still makes me smile when I watch it, even when I hear it. So when I first had a chance to interview Fee Waybill years back, one of the first questions I asked him about was that trip. Fee and Lori both have great stories about the Tubes on SCTV.
We flew up to Edmonton where they filmed SCTV, and we were staying in a hotel in Edmonton, and the producer of the show said, okay, well, we're going to shoot it at this cabin, this hunting lodge out in the wilderness about an hour away from Edmonton. And they said, the limo, the cars will be there at 6 a.m. to pick you up. And we're going to go out and we're going to shoot all day. We're going to get the whole thing done in one day. And I said, okay, great. So next morning, 6 a.m., the two limos show up. And in one limo is John Candy. And the other limo's empty. And so I went, okay, I'm going with John. And you guys get in the other one, and I was a huge fan of John Candy. And Catherine O'Hara and everybody, SCTV was Rick Moranis and Dave Thomas and everybody. We were huge fans of SCTV. So I got in the limo with John, and it's 6 o'clock in the morning, and John has got a case of beer, which is about half gone, and a big bag of weed. And he's in the back rolling joints and drinking beer. And I went, okay, this is cool, And so we got completely stoned out of our mind, drank about 8 beers, and we get to the, and I'm thinking, oh my God, how am I gonna remember lines? What's the script gonna say? What are we gonna need to do? And I get there and I went, okay, well, where is it? We have a script? And John went, script? What do you mean? I said, well, no, there's no script. We're just gonna wing it. We're gonna just follow my lead. And I just, okay, whatever you say. And so there was the whole day. There was no script. There was no nothing. We just said whatever came out of our mouths, pretty much. And we did the fishing thing, and we were pulling up boots and cans and bottles. And then we did the thing inside the cabin with, and they didn't tell us this either. They bring in like 40 pounds of fish, gutted trout or something. They go, here you go. And they go, you're going to sing sushi right here to a track. And there's a big mound of white rice and a gigantic pile of gutted fish. And really? Okay. Well, and I'm just gone completely. And I just went, okay, whatever. Do whatever. Let's do it. What the heck?
When they got to the set that day, they were out, they're out going out on these boats. And John Candy weighed good and plenty. And so Fee couldn't get in the boat with him. The thing would have frickin' sank with the guy, with the guy who was rowing the boat. So they go, well, look, we're going to have to put the skinny guy in with John Candy.
Oh, yeah. Vince's look when he's sitting in the boat is just so classic, too. He's got that kind of, quirky little look on his face while he's sailing in it. So that's funny. I guess that makes sense now that I look back at it.
Oh, yeah. He said all they did was smoke joint after joint after joint on the boat, that they were completely high the whole day. And, and it was pretty much kind of, they just kind of did it on their own as they went along, except for, the sushi part, the song, when they did Sushi Girl. But yeah. But so, more of that would have been, they should have had a manager who could have bombarded the market with all the positive things. And they could have pushed harder for their uniqueness to be presented instead of their ability to turn into Toto or whatever. But that's the way not Ricky Farr, but what's his name? Well, Ricky also. They couldn't get past that one part of not understanding the band and trying to turn them into something that they did understand. That just wasn't ever going to be the Tubes. It isn't them today. It never was them. and it never can be them.
Now, Lori does mention the pressure that the Tubes were feeling by the time that they started working with David Foster in the early 1980s, and a lot of bands felt that kind of pressure. One of the things that I loved about the song Sushi Girl is that it was a slickly produced David Foster song, but boy, it was all Tubes. Just the quirkiness, the sexual innuendos, everything. Just a great track. And I agree with Lori. I think that SCTV performance was, well, it was good for the band. And they should have done more things like that. The Completion Backwards Principle had a lot of great cuts on it. Unfortunately, Sushi Girl wasn't the big hit on the album. The big hit was Talk to You Later, which is one of the songs on the record that is not written by the Tubes. And it didn't have to be that way, because originally the first single released on the Completion Backwards Principle was actually a song that was written by Vince.
In the freezing cold, barely alive, have to make love to survive. I'll show you how it's done. We take it as it comes, a rocket to the sun.
Now, hopefully I don't get in any copyright trouble with Capitol Records, but I just got to say, every time I hear that song, it just blows me away. That's Bill Spooner handling the lead vocals. Fee sings the hits, but Bill Spooner, what an incredible vocalist. If you see the Tubes these days, Fee will be the lead singer on it. But man, Bill, what an amazing job. Now, my point is that, unfortunately, Don't Want to Wait Anymore didn't wind up being the hit, because that is a Tube song, even though it has all the characteristic Foster production, because the label was looking for a rock ballad. Here's Fee talking about it and how Vince had a part in writing that particular song.
Kind of during that era in 1980, when Foster came up to the studio, the record company, all the business was kind of into big rock ballads. That was what was happening. And there was, Journey had a big rock ballad, and I don't know, REO Speedwagon had a big rock ballad. And the record company told David, we need a big rock ballad. That's what we want to release with this first album on Capitol. And David came up and told us that, and we kind of went, really a ballad? We're kind of a rock band. We're not really a big rock ballad kind of band. And he went, well, that's what we're looking for here. And Vince said, well, I actually have this tune that I wrote. Let me play it for you. And he played Don't Want to Wait Anymore for you. And David just kind of went, oh my God, that's it. That's the one. Probably my favorite song to sing. And it's one of those songs where, you meet people, we always do a meet and greet after the show. And we will this tour. And people always say, they come up to me and they say, oh God, that song was, that was our wedding song. Or, I met my wife at a Tubes concert, and that was both of our favorite songs, and we ended up getting married, and then blah. So, it's a hard song to sing. It's high, and it's really it really kind of pulls at your gut strings to sing it, but it's one of my favorites for sure. In fact, when I announce that song during the show, I always mention him.
So, and it was actually number 1 in 17 countries, but not the United States, because the record company said, we want a ballad. We went, what? A ballad? Yeah, a big ballad, a big rock ballad, like Journey and REO Speedwagon have big ballads. We want a big ballad. And we went, well, we don't have any big ballads. And they went, well, write one then, okay? And so we were in our little rehearsal studio in San Francisco on Linden Street, and we were thinking, trying to go, oh, we've got to come up with a ballad. What the fuck, you know? Not our forte. And Vince Welnick started playing the chords to Don't Want to Wait Anymore. And David Foster was there, and he said, that's it. That's the song right there. And so our dearly beloved Vincent Welnick, who passed in 2006, is still watching me sing this song. I can feel it every time I introduce it. And
well, that was Fee dedicating Don't Want to Wait Anymore to Vince. That's from a concert in Greenwich, Rhode Island on December 7th, 2023. And after the completion backwards principle, the Tubes had a hit with Talk to You Later. And even though Don't Want to Wait Anymore wasn't a hit in the United States, it was a hit overseas. So the band had some chart success. The next album, Outside Inside, again, one of my favorite records that I feel really conflicted about. Foster winds up having an even bigger influence on this record by bringing in a ton of outside musicians, including Steve Lukather from Toto, who was really Foster's right-hand man at the time. And boy, could he write himself a rock song. But the problem is that the more musicians that you have on an album by the Tubes that aren't members of the Tubes, well, the less it feels like a Tubes record, the more it feels like a David Foster record. And ultimately, this begins the schism between the Tubes and their lead singer, Fee Waybill.
The band didn't want to do a third album with him against my protestation. I mean, after having two big hits with him, in our defense, he came to us and said, hey, I want to do more She's a Beauty type songs. I want to work, I want to write 3 or 4 songs with Steve Lukather and Fee and have a single to follow up She's a Beauty. And the band kind of, like I said, against my better wishes, they said, no, you can't tell us what to do. We're a band. We don't want to do that. And I understand. But in his defense, he's one of those guys that will do whatever it takes to get what he wants. The ends don't matter to him to get to the mean. The means don't matter to get to the end is what I meant to say. He's got an idea of what he wants, and if you're not cutting it, he'll find somebody else. I mean, a couple of times, we had, like we had a substitute bass player for a song that Rick couldn't figure out or something, or was having trouble with, or if Vince was in there doing a keyboard part and he was, he couldn't get it, or he was rushing or doing something else, Foster would just go, okay, well, fine, thanks a lot, and then he would go play it. And so he didn't have a lot of, détente, shall we say. But he knew what he wanted, and he did get the end when it came to both of those albums. Those albums turned out great, and maybe the pride of the band was injured, and we bailed out on him and went to Todd Rundgren, and maybe that's kind of what turned him off. But and that ended up precipitating me quitting the band, because I just said, you guys, you can't do this. Just nobody cares who wrote the song. Nobody cares. It's us. We played the song, and they're not wondering. Okay, just don't worry about it. It'll be fine, and we'll have another third hit. But no, they didn't. They wouldn't do it, and I left.
Fee got a little bit ahead of himself. He didn't leave right after the band decided not to work with David Foster for the next album, which would be Love Bomb. What he did do is he did record a solo album called Read My Lips with, well, David Foster and Steve Lukather. And this is where I always get to thinking, what would have happened if the Tubes did do that third album with David Foster as producer? Would they have had the same success as Chicago? Well, I think the fact that Fee Waybill's Read My Lips didn't have the kind of chart success that Completion Backwards Principle or Outside Inside did kind of indicates that maybe there was more to it. I did find this interview clip of David Foster talking about the Tubes and how he just never understood why the band didn't want to work with him again. Pay attention to his tone of voice.
The Tubes, being from San Francisco, I have to ask about the Tubes because while I was in San Francisco in the late 70s, as you mentioned, they were as explosive as a local group as Huey Lewis became later.
Yeah.
Just wildly explosive.
Yeah, they never hit their stride per se, but again, There was another group that was
White Punks on Dope made it to the top 100, maybe.
Made it to the top 10, but they only had one top 10 hit, and what was it? A song that Steve Lukather and I and Fee Waybill wrote called She's a Beauty.
Yes.
Which was their only top 10 hit.
That's crazy.
Yeah, and they resisted the hell out of that song. I mean,
it felt too commercial to them?
Yes, felt too commercial.
Why would you want success?
Exactly, yeah. So that was a tough grind to get them to do that song. They didn't particularly, some of them did not love working with me at all, because I was too straight, and but I was determined to get them a hit.
Right.
Because that's what they needed.
Right.
I thought.
Yeah.
So Fee and Steve Lukather from Toto and I wrote that song. Prairie Prince, the drummer, was great. Mike Cotton, the programmer, went on to do great things with Michael Jackson, like really elevated his career after that.
Right.
A couple of them fell by the wayside, but Fee's still out there touring, singing.
Yeah.
Now, when I listen to Foster's dismissive tone of the band, you'll notice he mentions Fee Waybill, and of course he mentions Steve Lukather and their part in the song She's a Beauty, and that the Tubes were resistant to the song. I don't know if the Tubes were resistant to the song. I think they were resistant to the fact that a lot of them didn't play on this song. And talking about people falling from their wayside, here's a fact. Vince Welnick is the only member of the Tubes that is a Rock and Roll Hall of Fame inductee. Yes, it's as a member of the Grateful Dead, but he's still in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. David Foster isn't in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And you could say what you want. You can have your opinions about whether that is an organization that has any kind of merit. It's still quite an accomplishment. And Vince was a keyboardist of one of the most popular bands in recorded music history, and certainly one of the most popular live bands ever. Fell by the wayside? Whatever, David. And again, that's not to say that I don't love those David Foster Tubes albums. I really do love them. And I love those Todd Rundgren albums as well. Now, next episode, we're going to devote to the Todd Rundgren stuff. The Love Bomb era. We'll get introduced to Tube singer David Killingsworth. But before we get to that, I want you to hear Prairie Prince's perspective on why the band decided not to work with David Foster anymore. And he puts it very succinctly. And keep in mind, Foster liked working with Prairie Prince.
Yeah, well, the whole thing was about our producer. Our producer wanted more than we wanted to give him in order to continue being our producer. And so that's what happened with that. The label gave us one more chance, and we went back to Todd Rundgren, who had produced the Remote Control record. And then, then Foster produced Outside, Inside, and Completion Backward Principle. But if he was going to do a third album for us, he had some pretty heavy demands that included pretty much not using the band at all. It would be more like a session musician band with the name The Tubes.
Well, I think Prairie pretty well summed it up. The Tubes were a band, a group of musicians, and they had pride. If a record's going to say The Tubes produced by David Foster, well, it only makes sense that the Tubes should be playing on that particular record. And sure, maybe they could have put out another one with Foster and had a couple of hits that they could schlep around the country, but these were guys that had pride, especially Vince. And while I think ultimately the decision to go back to Todd Rundgren for Love Bomb may not have turned out the way that they wanted it to, I don't know that any producer could have salvaged the Tubes' career by the time 1985 rolled around. But that's a story for next week. Let's close with some very interesting perspective from Lori Welnick about both David Foster and answering the question, who is her favorite producer of the Tubes?
When they were working with David Foster, Vince had a specific way to play the piano, and with the Tubes, the things they would write together, create together as a band, as a group, they were huge. And like the solo, the intro solo to the montage of songs, that they did. And I walked into the studio and I heard the solo on White Punks as well.
Yeah.
But I heard David Foster playing the piano. I didn't know it was him, but I just walked in, and I'm a kind of right off the cuff. I say exactly what I'm feeling at that moment. Not good, but I do it anyway. And I went, who the hell's playing the piano? It wasn't Vince, and I knew it. It was David Foster. And this kind of thing was it sort of permeated throughout Tubes recordings. And I have to say, honestly, and people have asked me this, and I've always said the same thing. What's your favorite Tubes album? And I say the first album. And my favorite producer, the favorite guy of all time was Al Kooper. And the reason is Al Kooper was the only person ever, the only one who ever worked with that band who knew, I don't know what the fuck you guys are doing. Just go ahead, I'm just going to record. Yeah. That was it. And he never tried to make them anything other than who they truly were. I loved Al Kooper. I just thought he was the best. The sound sucked on that album. The engineer was horrible. But Al Kooper, he was the best ever.
Thanks for listening to Missing Man, the Vince Welnick Story. I hope you're enjoying it, and I hope you would consider putting up a positive review or sharing it with somebody you think might enjoy it. Once again, special thank you to Lori Welnick and Prairie Prince and Fee Wable for all their great contributions to this episode. Next week, we'll be hearing from Bobby Strickland, Michelle and Todd Rundgren, and of course, more from Lori, Fee, Prairie, and maybe a few other surprises. This podcast is produced and edited by myself, Thom Jennings. And the project is made possible with funds from the Statewide Community Regrant Program, a regrant program of the New York State Council on the Arts with the support of the Office of the Governor and the New York State Legislature, and administered by my dear friends at Go Art in Genesee County. We'll see you in 2 weeks.